message from our sponsor, the Royal Literary Fund.
Are you a professional writer struggling with financial difficulties? The Royal Literary Fund is here to support you. At the RLF, we believe that every writer deserves a chance to thrive, no matter what life throws your way. We offer a variety of hardship grants tailored to help professional writers in need, whether it's short-term relief or ongoing support. Perhaps you're dealing with an unexpected expense, a drop in income, or facing challenges that make writing difficult, such as illness, disability, or now relying on your pension. If you're eligible, our grants team will walk you through our discreet and confidential application process, ensuring you receive the support you need. Visit rlf.org.uk to check your eligibility and inquire today. The Royal Literary Fund. We believe writers matter because writing matters.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we spoke to the television producer and novelist Eleanor Moran.
We spoke to Eleanor about her work in television and film, her fiction, including the decision to publish some of it under the pseudonym Kate Ruby, and her latest novel, Everything You Have.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it. Eleanor, welcome to Always Take Notes. It's great to have you on the show. So can you just start with, your fiction is published under Kate Ruby. Could you tell us this decision to write under a pseudonym, why you did that and how that fits together?
Yeah, absolutely. My television work is a separate career. So within that sphere, I'm Eleanor Moran, which is my actual name. And I wanted to create a separation between that side of my career in which I'm working with writers and pitching writers to broadcasters and the novelist side of my career. And also, in part, it's because my novels are developed for television and it's a little odd to be selling into, say, Disney, for example, as yourself. So that sort of degree of separation makes both careers a little bit cleaner and easier.
And you'd written a few novels before you adopted the pseudonym. Was that in part because of the kind of complications that you're describing?
Yeah, and actually, other novelists will speak to this. I think sometimes your publisher wants to kind of give you a refresh. It can be quite useful to effectively start again as a debut. At the very beginning of my career, I wrote rom-coms, and now I write domestic thrillers. So although I'd made that movement in the last couple of books I wrote under Eleanor Moran, it felt like a really good moment to just have a completely clean break and start again as Kate Ruby.
And could you tell us about the new book, Everything You Have? Where did this begin as a project for you?
I think that the workplace is such a fascinating arena. I've had a lot of therapy in my last novel, Tell Me Your Lies. That's with a kind of therapy precinct where a therapist infiltrates a family and sort of takes them apart from the inside. So I love writing about family and family dynamics. And in an odd kind of way, a workplace is also a family. You know, we spend potentially more time with our colleagues than we do with our actual family. Some of those rivalries and difficulties that we might experience at home or with our siblings absolutely can play out in the workplace. And having, spent the last 20 years working in television in different kind of corporate environments, I really felt like there's a real appetite for using the workplace as a backdrop. It's interesting that shows I suppose I always think about television when I'm constructing a novel. And when I think about, say, industry or the morning show and what a splash they've made in television, or even This Life going really far back, I just think it's just a really interesting space to explore.
And can you tell us a little bit about the characters and the plot for listeners who may not have picked up the novel yet?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's a dual protagonist novel. It's told from the point of view of our older character, Sasha, who works in branding, which is kind of adjacent to advertising. She's been within an organisation for 20 odd years and to some degree is probably coasting. Anyway, she hires a new assistant, Jenna, and takes an immediate liking to her. I would say has quite a kind of big sister / maternal attitude to her. And mentors her as her protege. But gradually, as the novel progresses, we realise that it's a bit of an all about Eve setup, and that Jenna is after her for some reason that we don't quite understand. There's a lot about kind of generational division as well. There's a campaign that they're doing for an airline, which is the centrepiece of the book. And that kind of really brings up a lot of questions about kind of what is acceptable, what we should be promoting, questions around the environment. the moral complexity of our choices at work. But as the novel progresses, we become increasingly fearful for Sasha as we realise that Jenna has kind of infiltrated her family as well as her workplace, and kind of wonder what her agenda really is.
You mentioned earlier this change of genre that you're operating in, and we really like for our listeners in whatever field of writing, we have to unpack some of these bits of industry terminology. So you said, your earlier writing would be positioned as rom-com, but this is more of a thriller. So, looking at particularly at the new book, could you talk about kind of what the rules of that game are in that area and how you're, working with or pushing against them?
Sure. I think, again, as I work in television and in novel writing, genre is such a kind of important definition of every project. So whilst when I'm working in TV, I might say I made an adaptation of Beth O'Leary's book, The Flat Share, which is a kind of unabashed rom-com a couple of years ago for Paramount Plus, which was a big hit. But then with another project, we did an adaptation of J.P. Delaney's The Girl Before, which is a kind of modern gothic thriller. So in television, you kind of get to play in different genres all the time. But with novels, you tend to be put in one particular bracket and then continue writing in that space. So my first novel was a rom-com about that kind of dilemma in your 30s about whether to marry the person you're with that looks perfect on paper, or whether you're kind of going to sort of throw it all in and hope for something better. And then from there, I wrote another 3 rom-coms. And then after that, I just got a little bored of the genre and moved over to writing psychological thrillers. So then I wrote a couple about a therapist who gets involved in criminal cases. So yeah, I've been able to dabble, but certainly changing my author name is helpful in terms of branding and clarity for readers, I would say.
How is your experience of working in television helpful to your writing? I think I saw somewhere that you sometimes imagine particular actors while you're writing characters. Is that right?
Yeah, I suppose that when, with television development, a very small proportion of scripts and shows that get developed actually get to the screen. So you have to be very kind of precise about the shots. You have to really have an incredibly clear concept, I would say. And then as well as an incredibly clear concept, you have to have a real specificity of voice in terms of the screenwriter who comes to that project. So I suppose with novels, I always try and make sure that they've got quite a really clear concept, a clear one-line pitch. And then I do, if I'm absolutely honest, I think about them for television as well when I'm writing them. So the previous novel, Tell Me Your Lies, was the subject of a 5-way bidding war for the TV rights. And as I wrote it, I was thinking, I can absolutely see how this works for multi-part television. And again, with this, I'm thinking, workplace is underexploited. It's a great place to explore really interesting character dynamics. So I write them with that in mind.
Another thing with our listeners always very interested in is the kind of pragmatics of how people organize their working lives. So with these 2 avenues that you have in TV and books, I mean, we saw that you have 1 day a week that's clear for writing, and then it's working around the side of your other job. Is that still current, or how do you manage the 2 sides of it?
Yes, unfortunately, my job is too busy for me to be out of the office for a day a week these days. So it's a lot of early mornings, honestly, and a lot of Sundays and a lot of coffee. And it's a juggle. So, I make it work somehow.
A question we often put to novelists on the show is the question of plotting versus plunging. So whether you have an outline of the plot worked out, whether it's in your head or on paper or on a spreadsheet or whatever it is, before you start writing, or whether you kind of dive in and see what happens. I have an inkling of what you're going to be, but tell us what your method is for constructing story.
That's a really interesting question. I think I'm a bit of both, actually. And I think you probably, I don't know, for me, I feel like you kind of have to be, in that for your characters to kind of find life and energy, they have to start living and breathing more as you write them. And I tend to find that maybe for my protagonist in any book, there's a little bit more of me perhaps than in the other characters. So that's an easier kind of puppet to master. But then for the secondary characters, you write into them. And certainly with this novel, with Jenna, she's in her 20s, she's starting out in her career. I've brought some of my experience from that time, but obviously, I'm some way down now and I'm a different generation. So I kind of let her evolve more. The other thing I would say is I talk to other writers, and I'm lucky to have an amazing script team who work with me at work as well as I go. So interestingly, with this novel, I realised that it actually needed an extra twist and that it was almost potentially feeling too linear. So that led to quite a big change during the course of the writing.
We wanted to come back to everything you have and your other contemporary projects in due course, but could we roll back now to the beginning of your, life really? And you've written elsewhere about your childhood and the complex relationships that you had with both your parents, but particularly your father growing up. Could you take us back to that time and in retrospect, how maybe, if you think that's the case, some of the roots of your writing run back to that period?
I mean, my father was an alcoholic and a very kind of unstable character, and that had quite a serious impact on my mental health growing up. And, when I reached 18, I realized that I actually really needed to get help. So I started therapy really young. And I suppose one of the things that I'm kind of always unpacking in my novels is that kind of hero's journey of how we come out the other side of trauma and how much we internalize it ourselves and feel, I think a lot of people really kind of struggle with self-esteem issues that actually are from outside forces, and yet don't necessarily understand that fact. And so I suppose I really like to create characters who go on a real kind of psychological arc. And also, having had, a great deal of therapy in my own life, Tell Me Your Lies is my most successful book, and that is absolutely about a heroine who is unraveling the after effects of living in a dysfunctional family. But unfortunately, the therapist she chooses has nefarious intent.
And then in terms of your love of books, you've said that you were a big reader of Enid Blyton growing up. You were a kind of a voracious reader. I'm assuming sort of studying English at university felt like a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, I suppose it did. And I suppose to your other point about how my childhood affects my work, that also plays very much into my work as a producer, probably in terms of the kind of books that I option some of the time. Something like The Girl Before, I really like psychological thrillers, both to write them, but also to make them. And yeah, that voracious reading. I mean, I've done a lot of adaptations over my TV career, from like Watership Down, The Psychology of Rabbits, to the latest Beth O'Leary adaptation we're doing, which is The Road Trip, which is a really, really fun rom-com that takes place as a kind of ex-couple make their way to Spain to a wedding, and we unravel their romantic history. So yeah, I'm all about books.
And could you tell us how your early steps after graduation worked? We saw you were, getting into TV right from the get-go, but also there was an Arvin course that played a pivotal role in getting you towards writing fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say that to other writers as well. So I wanted to write. I was a script editor at the BBC at that point, and I really wanted to write, but trying to just write on my own and look at a blank page was almost impossible. And I think it is almost impossible to do that. Some people manage it, but I do think I've recommended to so many friends who want to write to just go and do a course, go and be immersed, go and get that support. And yeah, I was really lucky that I started writing my first rom-com, which was about that kind of romantic dilemma about whether to get married or not, at a point when I was in that dilemma myself. And an agent from Curtis Brown approached me who'd heard about it and picked it up. And then that gave me the encouragement to finish it. And then I was lucky that I got a few offers on it, and then I was away.
We love to get into the specifics of finding agents and things as well. But in terms of the Arvon course, how did the manuscript take shape while you were doing that course? Did you, how many kind of words did you get down as part of that? And, what was the feedback process like?
I think Arvon courses are brilliant. Certainly mine was. I think it was just that it was kind of like being back at school and just having that space away from any distraction, just having to write every day, having tutors to feed back. It just allowed me to have enough of a chunk to then be able to continue. And it's often that first sort of 5,000 words that you need with any book. Even now it's the same. Then you've got something to build on. The other thing I would say, which is, partly the discipline of Arvon, but I just think when one is writing or starting to write, actually setting yourself a word count and just hitting it. I have I'm lucky enough to know some really interesting screenwriters through my other job. And Robin Schiff, who wrote Romeo and Michelle's High School Reunion, who's been quite a mentor to me over the years. She writes on Emily in Paris now. She gave me a very simple exercise when I first wanted to write, which is an egg timer, which you just set and you just have to just stay in front of your computer. And even if you just type, I hate writing for half an hour, it just like builds the muscle and gives you the discipline to just keep going.
We are thrilled to announce the publication of Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers. The book, edited by the two of us, features contributions from almost 100 past guests on the podcast. It's a distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 6 years.
The book offers, we think, frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Published by Ithaca Press, Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers is available now in all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it.
We're jumping obviously a bit back and forth between TV and novels here, but how did your TV career, both how did you break in at the beginning and then through your decade at the BBC and then moving, to different pastures, how did that develop? And maybe if you could mention, Spooks and some of the particular projects that you worked on.
Yeah, so I started as a publicist at Channel 4, actually. I got work experience and then an internship came up and that was incredibly fun. But I just didn't find it, in the end, sort of writing press releases and working on other people's creative work just felt a bit limiting. So I took a sort of slightly wild leap and went to the BBC, to their press office, hoping that I'd be able to get over into drama. And gradually I started script reading for people and kind of assessing material, which in retrospect, I think is kind of mad because I probably didn't know anything at all. But yeah, then I started as a trainee script editor and then kind of worked my way up and then went back to the BBC in a more senior role later on. And yes, I've been lucky enough to work on, I worked on some great shows during those 10 years at the BBC. Eventually, I was an executive producer. So I worked on Spooks, I worked on Rome, I worked on Being Human. I actually worked really closely on New Tricks when it started, which isn't necessarily a very cool show, but it was a very, very popular one and still is constantly on UK drama. And then, yes, after that moved out into the independent sector, which is where I work now. And I run a drama department.
In those early days of being a trainee script editor and then a script editor, what was that experience like giving feedback to writers? Did you find you found the process of delivering that feedback quite straightforward and easy, or was there a lot of kind of ego wrangling that went on?
Well, it's a tricky old balance, that actually, because I supervise, I have brilliant script editors who work for me, but it also, when I look back on it, sometimes I think I probably overstepped, if anything, and you're sort of learning, you're kind of learning the ropes. I was mentored by some amazing people. I'm very lucky to do that, but it's definitely a job that involves a lot of sensitivity and judgment.
And again, for our listeners who may not know what these terminology means, could you unpack what being an executive producer involves? What are the different aspects of the job? And, again, maybe with regard to a particular project you've worked on, but just, take us into that world.
Well, say I take you through, say, The Girl Before. It's a book by J.P. Delaney. It sold a few million copies. When it was first published, when it was first offered to publishers, it came up on our book scout list. So you have a book scout sometimes when you do my job who will alert you to what books are being sold in the market. And what you're doing there is you're also monitoring the kind of size of, as well as obviously wanting to fall in love with the manuscript, you're kind of monitoring the kind of size of deals that books are getting, how many territories they're selling to, because that gives you quite a strong indication of how big they might be on publication. And if they're big on publication, when you're trying to sell them as a show, it's really helpful that they've got profile. So The Girl Before, which is a fantastic gothic thriller about a woman who moves into this perfect house designed by this architect, which has these very, very strange rules which you have to live by. But if you live by it and give the house your kind of, really kind of sign yourself over to the house to kind of learn your habits and learn who you are, and answer things like moral dilemmas, the landlord, who's this kind of mysterious individual, will let you live there for a peppercorn rent. And then she discovers that the girl who lived there before died and becomes obsessed with finding out what actually happened to her. Anyway, it was such a great concept that Ron Howard optioned the book almost immediately on manuscript. So I obviously was never going to be able to compete with Ron Howard, forgot about it. But then I kind of tracked it because it didn't seem to get made. It had been optioned as a movie, nothing seemed to happen. And then I heard about 2.5 years later that, and by that time the book was a bestseller, that it had come out of option and it hadn't worked. So I contacted the agent and went and met the author and begged him to option it to me, and said that if we made it, he was British, said that if we made it out of the UK, he'd have much more control, and I'd also give him the opportunity to write the script. So he turned down other American offers and came with us. And then I took it to a commissioner at the BBC who I knew had, when he'd been in the independent sector, also competed for the rights for the book when it first came out. So he was really keen to be a part of it. So then at that point, you go into development at a broadcaster. So the BBC then commissioned a script, which I then supervised from J.P. Delaney, the author. And then you go through a number of drafts. And then at that point, you might just get put into turnaround. It's over. Hopefully you set it up somewhere else, or maybe you don't, and the whole thing is over. It was in competition with a couple of other projects at the BBC, and this was during COVID, so it was obviously a really strange time. And then what we did was we attached Gugu Mbatha Raw from the morning show to it to give it more kind of profile and heft within the BBC commissioning process. That got it a lot of attention. And then we started also talking to US buyers as well. And like Apple got very excited about it. Disney got very excited about it. And then that got enough heat on it that the BBC greenlit it. So we were off to the races. So then at that point, you're choosing a director. So we had a wonderful director called Lisa Brillman. I really wanted a female director for it. And then you're doing the rest of the casting. So having a piece of talent as kind of high profile as Gugu Mbatha Raw, she was able to then bring David Oyelowo to it. And then we cast around it. We cast a wonderful actress called Jessica Plummer, who ended up being BAFTA nominated as the third lead in the piece. Yeah, and then you go into production. So then it's doing all the kind of, more nuts and bolts things, like hiring all your heads of department. Like, the whole piece is around this beautiful architectural house. So we had to build that in a studio in Bristol. So finding the right production designer to make that look incredible. A lot of people who saw it asked where the house was, and actually it was just a set, but it truly looked like a house. So it's all that kind of thing. So you're kind of jigsawing the rest of the cast together and getting that right. And actually we ended up making it for the BBC and HBO. So then you're juggling two broadcasters who might have different opinions on the scripts. We were kind of scripting it right up to the last minute when we went into production. What often happens is you work on developing the first script in a series for ages. It gets greenlit and suddenly you have to be in production 3 months later, and then you have to just go like the clappers to get the rest of the scripting done. And then you're coming out the other side, you're doing all the publicity, all of that kind of thing. The edit is also as much a part of the production as any other bit, really. Like, things change so much when you're editing them and you're making all the music choices and that kind of thing. So right now I'm editing this show, The Road Trip. And you go on a real journey with that part of the process. That's an example of a production from beginning to end. But a lot of my work is about finding the best possible writers to work with. And then obviously some ideas are completely original. So then you're working them up from scratch with a writer. And then also finding that incredible material, whether that's books or perhaps it's a format from another country, like it's a Dutch show that you find a new option. And, something like Humans, which is a big hit Channel 4 AMC show, that was originally, I think, a Belgian format. So there's a lot of that goes on as well.
Thank you for talking in such depth. It's absolutely fascinating. How important is it in this day and age, with perhaps a particularly lavish production, to arrange those distribution rights in other territories before you've started production in earnest?
It's really important. I think a lot of shows, it can happen in the UK at the moment because budgets have really gone up in the last sort of 10 years. You can get a show greenlit, but then you might have the kind of the first broadcaster in, whether that's, say, BBC or ITV, for example, and then you can't raise the rest of the finance because you don't get a US buyer, or you can't jigsaw the finance together from different territories like France and Germany to get you up to a full production budget. So one thing that is also quite a key part of my job is, I travel to America quite regularly, make sure that I'm familiar with those buyers and they know us and feel that they can trust us. And sometimes even we're selling a show. My previous novel, Tell Me Your Lies, is actually set up with stars in the US, and we haven't put the UK piece together yet. We're starting with the US in that instance.
Just expanding on that last point you made, can you tell us about, how these two parts of your life, so the TV life and then the novel writing life, how they've come to cross with your own work, attracting TV interest? And again, if you just talk us through both the step-by-steps of how it's worked practically, but also what that's been like experientially, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I've written 8 novels and 5 of them have been optioned. So they've been quite different experiences. It might be useful to just kind of talk through. So my novel, Breakfast in Bed, which was a rom-com set in a restaurant.
Could you maybe, sorry to interrupt, but again, just for our listeners who may not know what the terminology means, just explain what an option is. I know we're really going back to very basic stuff, but it's just, so this is totally accessible.
Yeah, so that will mean that a production company will come to you and say, we want to option your novel. We're going to develop it for television or for film. So in that instance, Mammoth, who are great, who make Poldark, and they make a lot of the Christies on both BBC One and ITV, came to me and said, we'd like to develop this. They were kind enough to give me the chance to actually script it. And we got it into development. So the BBC then wanted to script it with us. So that's a big deal because that is the route to production, is having a broadcaster on board. But we just didn't get it quite right. I mean, it actually put me off adapting my own work because it's actually really hard. And I often do say to novelists, are you sure you want to do this, when they want to adapt themselves? So that, we did a script, didn't work. That was that. Then on the next 2, they were more of a kind of procedural crime format, which was partly intentional. They were called A Daughter's Secret and Too Close for Comfort, published by Simon & Schuster. And I'd met someone when researching a TV project who advises he's a psychologist who advises the police on crimes. And I thought that was a really fascinating role for both for a TV and for a novel. And again, gave me the chance to kind of delve into my interest in therapy and how it works and the kind of therapist-client relationship. So those books were optioned by Element, who made Normal People. So again, really, really good producers. But they just didn't quite, again, there was quite a lot of interest, but in that instance, they never went into development with a broadcaster. So they were never bought for production. The script didn't quite come together. I didn't write the script. But so that was, again, a little disappointing, but, a good experience to work with them. And then with Tell Me Your Lies, I felt that was the strongest from a TV point of view of anything I'd written. And then I decided to run that through the company I worked for, which at the time was 42. I've actually just left 42. But rather than it being me pitching it to buyers, which just felt too awkward, I brought on another company, Federation, which, so there's another me there, my friend Polly Williams. So we're executive producers together on it. And then we brought a writer who's wonderful, Stephanie Aspin, onto it. We developed a pitch for it. So that is where you might actually go out and sort of have a 20-minute presentation about your kind of plan for the book. So you sort of talk through the concept and then talk through the episodes. It's a more American device, but we decided that the book felt quite global in its reach and that we were going to do US style pitches. So we took that to 9 different buyers. And we got 5 offers, and actually most of the offers were out of the US. So 3 of the 5 offers were out of the US. And then it got set up at Disney, which was really exciting. So it was for Hulu in the US and then Disney in the UK. They're all part of the same family. And then it didn't work out there. And then it got picked up by one of the other buyers who are Stars, which is where it's being developed now.
You've said that you're not that keen on adapting your own work going forward, but how do you find that experience of collaborating with someone else? Do you find it's really productive to have someone who's coming at it from a different angle, or is it quite hard in some ways to kind of meet halfway with someone else who hasn't written the original kind of source material?
I mean, weirdly, it's been absolutely wonderful. I've loved it. I mean, it's been really joyous, and there's other writers on it too now, and we've all my script editing team, I've got a really wonderful development team as well. Everyone's poured loads into it, and actually it's quite different now. So in the novel, for example, it's very much psychological between the therapist and the family, and there is a crime plot to it, and there is a kind of long con aspect to it. But within the TV format, it's for like a multi season show, hopefully. Like, I'd say the model is something like The Affair. So now there's a murder in the first season, which absolutely wasn't in the book, and we've completely changed the ending to create a bigger hook. But all of that is really exciting. And similarly with Everything You Have, the new book, it's hopefully a really strong domestic thriller set within an office. But for the TV version, there will need to be whole new aspects that make it really sustain and give you a really kind of big canvas to paint on.
Another point that often comes up in our discussions with screenwriters and people who work in TV or film are the differences between the American showrunner and writer's room model and the British sort of lone screenwriter model. What are your thoughts of the relative merits of the two? And if there is a blurring taking place? And then with your own projects, how are they working out between those two poles?
Yeah. I mean, I work in America quite a bit, so I see both things close up. I'd say that the American model is quite different in that my job doesn't exist often in quite the same way. So in the UK, executive producers are quite kind of hands-on creatively, whereas in the US, showrunners tend to be kind of really schooled in writers' rooms and by more senior showrunners, and then they're more, or they can be more producerial sometimes. Some obviously many writers here are also very producerial, but in the US it's sort of inherent to the job in a slightly different way. Whereas here, some writers really do like to just kind of write the script and then let it happen over there. But I do think that the writers' room system is also really useful here. Like every show, pretty much that we do that has got sort of 6 to 8 episodes, having a room, something like The Flat Share, again, brilliant book from Beth O'Leary, but we did a proper writer's room in order to really kind of work out all the serial storylines and make sure they join up, and to invest all the writers writing individual episodes in the entire canvas of the whole piece, rather than just being siloed working on one script.
It's a rule of the show that we always ask guests about money. I was struck by something you said earlier in terms of having kind of the TV adaptation side of things in the back of your mind while you're writing your novels. Was that partly a financial decision in that the money involved with television adaptation is much bigger perhaps than what is involved in novel writing? Or what was the kind of... Is it also partly born out of admiration for that medium? I mean, tell us a little bit about why the relationship between those two things exists and whether it's a financial one. Yeah, no, that's a completely fair, good question. I do think that that writers are really underpaid in this country, actually, generally. And I think, when you look at how much books retail for in America in comparison to here, it's definitely, I'm glad that it's not my full-time job, for sure. Definitely. So yeah, the financial aspect is definitely a part of it. Although really the serious money comes when something actually gets greenlit, which hasn't happened for me yet. And, is a tough thing to get to for any writer. And then, yeah, I mean, I love the medium. And for me, the two are so kind of interconnected. And I suppose I think visually, I probably do think in a kind of 3-act structure when I'm writing. So I almost can't separate the two. So a bit of practicality and a bit of love for the genre.
And which do you see going forward that you're looking to combine these two avenues? So the fiction writing and then this big producer job you have, and as you say, that's clearly very demanding, and you're having to write around the edges. I mean, what I suppose would be your ideal balance, or would you concentrate on one of those fields, or just see how things are going to work out organically?
Yeah, I've written some screenplays as well. So I've had a show that was developed at Sky. I feel I get jumpy if I'm not writing at all. I do enjoy it, but I'm not actually in a rush right now to jump into another book, because actually the level of work it takes is huge. And now I've got, 2 novels of my own that I'll be working on in the TV sphere. So that feels like it will use some of that brain space. And certainly if Tell Me Your Lies does get greenlit, I will write an episode on it. So I would say probably more leaning on the scripting side of TV rather than actually necessarily writing another novel and doing it that way. It's quite a long-winded way to get to the screen.
In terms of your novel writing, how long would you spend kind of gestating a project? And how, within that, how do you go about research?
I normally, say with this novel, it's set in a branding company. So I spoke to a friend who worked in branding. But I mean, normally I like the thematics for this around branding and the idea that you are trying to make a person feel a certain thing. I felt that was psychologically interesting as a backdrop and related to the kind of interplay between the characters as the kind of power play becomes more vicious and more complex. And in terms of how long I take to gestate a project, well, with Tell Me Your Lies, I read about a real case in which a really highfalutin therapist infiltrated a number of kind of upper-class families and turned their daughters against them. This case is quite notorious now. But I read then a kind of counterpiece from one of the daughters who said, actually, this woman changed my life. She's amazing, kind of thing. And I thought the he said, she said of that within a kind of family format was really interesting, and that there was something really valuable to explore there. So it tends to be that I just find a sort of germ of an idea and then I kind of create something completely kind of fantastical on top of it. But I need a kind of central premise that interests me. And I suppose for everything you have, the new novel, I am quite interested in the whole way in which the interplay between generations at work and in a kind of broader sense in society right now, it feels like there's a lot of friction there. And yeah, I really wanted to kind of unpack that in a hopefully entertaining thriller format.
You mentioned earlier that you've often taken therapy as a subject for your writing, and it's something you've experienced yourself. And you mentioned, I was struck earlier in our conversation, you said you had this interest with people who've had challenging upbringings as to whether they've come through that. Do you feel that you have?
Yeah, I do. I think we always retain bruises, for sure. I think it's one thing that I've kind of come to believe as I've got older and through the work I've done is that it can be dangerous to wait for this kind of glorious day where you're completely healed. But what I hope is that we kind of alchemize our difficult experiences and they kind of give us depth or compassion or wisdom in different ways, or perhaps the ability to help other people who are struggling. So they bring gifts as well as also having their drawbacks.
Do you think therapy and psychiatry is going to be something that's kind of present in your novels kind of going forward? I mean, obviously the psychological aspect of things is always going to be present, but as in terms of having characters that kind of work in the field, do you think that's something that you'll continue to write into your books?
I don't know about that. The new novel does have a little of that. Sasha, the lead character, she's got a great deal of psychological wounding that she's pushed down, and she is forced into therapy at one point. And, there is a strand in the novel. But I think it's probably something I'm more interested in exploring in TV. I think there's kind of different ways to cut it, which are interesting. And certainly my hope is that Tell Me Your Lies happens and then we can do kind of multiple seasons. And although in that the therapist is not really a therapist you would want to have, and I would like to find some more positive representations of therapy to bring to the screen.
We've had a few people on the podcast who, like yourself, have had kind of parallel careers as executives and practitioners in the industry they're in. So we had Perry Thompson a few episodes ago, who's both a children's publisher and a children's author, although in slightly different age groups. I mean, a point that's often made about the creative industries in general is that they're quite opaque and it can be quite difficult to get into. I mean, what do you think the fact that, this is no criticism at all of your work, but that there are people, who are already in that environment who are the ones producing that content, what does that say about the industries as a whole?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand the question. The other people in...
Yeah, that, when it's people who either work in publishing themselves or previously work in TV who are then the ones who are branching across to be scriptwriters or writers, rather than it being more people perhaps coming in from completely outside that world.
It's a tricky one. Yeah, there are quite a lot of writers who go up through the kind of script editing, producing route, I guess, because you kind of you kind of learn quite a lot about structure and what sells and all of that kind of thing. I do think that access to the industry is a really kind of vital conversation. And certainly when I'm producing shows, we try and find opportunities for writers who are kind of earlier in their career, or playwrights who haven't had a screen credit yet. And I do think it's really important as an industry that we kind of try and find more access points for people generally. So I agree with you. I think it's definitely something that needs addressing.
One thing I wondered as well is perhaps looking back over your career, whether you felt the pressures on you as a producer had changed. I mean, with the advent of streaming, obviously that's given you more places to sell to, but presumably the onus on numbers and viewing hours and all that stuff is a lot higher. Have you found that to be the case?
Yeah, I think it's quite complex. I mean, certainly budgets have risen so significantly that it does make putting a show together harder for sure, in a way that, early in my career, say, if you got a show commissioned by ITV or the BBC, you'd just be off to the races. You could just go on that, you could be funded by that one buyer and you'd be fine. Whereas now, whilst a streamer will probably provide your entire budget, a terrestrial broadcaster will not do that. Although, to get a bit inside baseball about it, you retain more rights. So in some ways you get a kind of longer tail. You can kind of earn income more in perpetuity once you have had that show fully financed. Whereas when you make a show for a streamer, you just get paid your fees and it's likely that they buy the show and you don't get it back. It's a difficult time in the industry generally. There were the writers' strikes last year in LA, which affected the whole business. There's been, quite a lot of instability. There's been instability at Paramount. Lots of shows got sort of their green lights reversed last year. We're not that far out of COVID. There's challenging headwinds for sure.
Where do you see it going? I mean, there was a lot of talk, as you say, when those that kind of period of contraction happened, that this amazing flowering of kind of prestige long form TV that we've seen over the last decade, that had hit the buffers. I mean, how do you? I know this is a very difficult thing to see, but to see the industry shaping in the next 10 years.
It's an interesting question. I mean, some people say that too much was getting made like 3 years ago. That certainly. I'd say more in America, there was such a proliferation of buyers, and it did feel like, I mean, the amount of scripted shows, it was very hard for your show to get any visibility in a way because there was just so much landing on every channel all the time. Whereas I'd say buyers are buying more judiciously now, and obviously we're hoping they're going to buy even more, but it's certainly not as overcrowded perhaps. So, yeah, I think we'll probably reach a kind of, I think it's definitely coming back. The contraction feels like, I was in America a few weeks ago and it certainly felt like there was a lot more optimism than there was, say, kind of 6 months earlier. It's a challenging time for the BBC. That's incredibly important for the whole creative community that the BBC thrives. It's hard to know, but I do think that the great content hopefully will continue to get through.
You mentioned earlier, and it's been reported elsewhere, that you've left 42, the company you're at for several years. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing next and the sort of projects you would like to work on within that kind of contracted prestige field?
Yes, I've left with one of the partners in the business, Rory Aitken, and we've set up a new company together with some of our team. Yeah, I don't think it's going to be like a major change. I think we'll be continuing to try and make really distinctive prestige television for the US and the UK. It will possibly be a little bit more focused. 42 is a really fantastic, exciting organisation which has a whole management side to the business as well, and is based in LA as well as in the UK. So we'll be a bit more kind of concentrated here. But yeah, excited to see what comes next.
Well, we're coming up against our time limit now, but as a final question from me, you said you had sort of mixed feelings about writing more book-length fiction. I mean, do you have an idea for another novel that's clicking away there, or is that something that's just on hold for the time being?
I do have the very, very kind of beginnings of an idea. I wrote Tell Me Your Lies out of contract, which was quite nice because there was no pressure and it could evolve. And I'm in a weird way, COVID did me a favour in that at the very beginning, it just gave me a little bit more time without commuting to just kind of hone it and refine it and finish it and then sell it. Everything You Have was the second part of that deal. So it's a little bit more of a kick bollock scramble. So I think the chance to possibly write something very, very slowly and hopefully finish it would be kind of a relief after that. So we'll see.
Well, we wish you the very best with that whenever it may land, and with this book and all your other projects going forward.
Thank you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Eleanor Moran. She's on Instagram and Twitter at Kate Ruby Books, and Everything You Have is published by Simon & Schuster. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Eleanor / Kate?
I thought it was an interesting conversation in particular because it crossed two genres, so TV and then also, writing fiction, which is not unknown to have a foot in both camps, but I thought she gave particularly good insights on both of it. And I think also this whole question of the use of pseudonyms is interesting. I mean, it always raises issues for us in the podcast because we have to work out what we're going to call someone. But it's, interesting the kind of decisions and the reasons that people choose to put their work out under, or parts of their working life out under different names. What about you?
Absolutely. I thought it was fascinating in the way that the conversation talked about those two camps separately, but also the interplay between them in her own work. In particular, the fact that she writes her books with adaptations in mind, with a kind of log line almost, as it's known in TV and film. And it was interesting as well, the massive changes that happen to a plot when a novel moves to the screen, just because screen storytelling requires so much more. Just requires so much more story. I think she gave the example of a murder that wasn't in the book, but is in the first season of the show. So yeah, it was great, as you say, wide-ranging conversation, and great to have yet another person involved in TV and film on the show. What have you been up to, Simon?
I was in America last week, not for very long. I just went for 4 days to have some meetings with magazine editors in New York, which was very good. The meetings were productive, but it was kind of cripplingly tiring because I didn't have time to get over the jet lag sort of either way. So I was then a little bit ill for a few days after I came back, but I'm now back and I'm really just head down now till Christmas just to finish my book on the mountains, which is good. It's sort of oddly mixed because the manuscript has a first person thread and a historical thread, and the first person thread is in quite good shape, but the history I almost wrote as kind of placeholder before I'd done a lot of the particularly archival research, so that involves basically rewriting it. So it's a sort of game of or two halves with the two different bits, and if I'm going to get finished by Christmas, which is my plan, I have a pretty grueling pace to hit. But so far I seem to have done that, so my confidence has risen a bit. And yeah, with the reading, I've just been reading material for that. Anyway, what about you?
Yes, much the same, to be honest, ticking along with various pieces. I thought if you actually, the theme of this podcast is book organisation, I feel like, and book shelving. And we have recently had our house painted, which required me to box up about 30 boxes of books, which I now have to put back. And I realised while organising the fiction side of things that fills all the bookshelf space that we had previously had. So I now have to order and find space for the non-fiction side of things. So that's going to be interesting.
What was your organising principle for fiction?
This is going to be controversial. I organise by colour, but then within the colour, it's also alphabetised. I am thinking I may have to kind of revert to a classic Dewey Decimal System at some point. But it took me so long to unpack everything just for the fiction that I can't bear the thought of doing it anytime soon. And then other than unpacking books, which is thrilling for listeners to hear about, I'm sure, I've been watching Slow Horses still, which I'm still gripped by. I've been reading Tim Winton's new novel in preparation for the interview with him. Consider that a trail for an upcoming episode. I've also watched a press screening of the film adaptation of Small Things Like These, a novella which I really loved, which is coming out in the UK in November. So yeah.
Lots going on. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser. Our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. You can support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon and always take notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.